Take a satellite photo of Canada at night, and you'll see something that makes no sense. The second largest country on the entire planet, a landmass bigger than the United States, almost as big as the whole of Europe, lights up in a single thin, glowing ribbon along its very bottom edge. Above that ribbon, there's almost nothing, just darkness stretching thousands of kilometers toward the North Pole. That's because nearly 90% of all Canadians are crammed into a narrow strip hugging the United States border. The rest of this colossal country, the overwhelming majority of its land, sits almost completely empty. So why does a nation this enormous huddle along one single line, and with all that open space above them, why can't Canadians just spread out? This is the geographic story behind the emptiest giant on earth. And here's a clue to hold on to. That border the whole country clings to isn't really a political line forcing people south. It traces something far older and far more powerful. But we'll come back to that. Let's start with the sheer scale of the emptiness, because it's almost impossible to overstate. Canada covers nearly 10 million square kilometers, close to the size of the entire continent of Europe. And yet, the whole country is home to only about 40 million people. That's roughly the same number of people who live in the single US state of California. Picture taking everyone in California and scattering them across a space the size of Europe, and you start to feel how empty this country should be. But they didn't scatter, they bunched up. So the real question isn't how few people Canada has, it's why they all chose to live along the same thin line. And to understand that, you first have to understand what the rest of Canada is actually made of. Look just north of those bright city lights, and you run straight into one of the most important and least talked about features on the planet, the Canadian Shield. This is a vast region of ancient, exposed bedrock, some of the oldest rock on Earth, and it covers nearly half of the entire country. During the last ice ages, glaciers ground across it like a continent-sized belt sander, scraping away almost all the soil and gouging out millions of lakes and bogs in the bare rock. The result is stunning to fly over and brutal to live on. There's barely any soil to plant in. The land is an endless maze of stone, water, and spongy muskeg. You can't easily farm it, you can't easily build on it, and you certainly can't feed a major city from the ground around it. And it only gets harsher the farther north you go. The shield gives way to dense boreal forest, then to treeless tundra, then to permafrost ground that has stayed frozen solid for thousands of years. Winters are long and savage. The growing season shrinks to almost nothing. Across enormous stretches of the north, the land simply will not support farming at all. In fact, of this entire giant country, only around 5% of the land is suitable for agriculture. Now compare all of that to the south. That thin strip along the border is where the climate is mildest, where the soil is finally rich enough to farm, and where the Great Lakes and the Saint Lawrence River hand you both fresh water and natural highways for moving goods. The land down there is so much gentler that Toronto actually sits at roughly the same latitude as Florence, Italy. In a country where most of the ground fights you, that southern ribbon is the one place that welcomes you. So the obvious question becomes, was it geography alone that pinned people there, or did history push them too? The answer is both. And the remarkable thing is how perfectly the history follows the geography. The first European settlers didn't march north into the frozen interior. They followed the water, specifically the St. N, Lawrence River, and the Great Lakes, which together formed a giant natural gateway deep into the continent. The earliest towns of New France and later of British Canada grew up along these southern waterways because that's where you could land a ship, trade your goods, plant a crop, and actually survive the winter. Then came the single moment that locked the entire pattern into place, the railway. In 1885, Canada finished the Canadian Pacific Railway, one iron line stretched all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and crucially, they ran it across the far south, close to the border. Part of the reason was simple practicality, that's where the livable land was. But part of it was fear. A young, thinly populated Canada was deeply nervous about its enormous neighbor expanding northward, and the Southern Railway was a way to plant towns, settlers, and sovereignty right along that line before anyone else could claim it. And it worked. Settlements sprang up like beads on a string wherever the railway stopped. The fertile prairies were opened and settled through it. Just like that, the Southern Corridor wasn't only where people could live, it was where the entire country had been deliberately wired to grow. But here's where it gets interesting. Because there's a third force pinning Canadians against the border, and it has nothing to do with soil or steel. It's money. Look at where that border actually leads. Straight into the United States, the largest economy on earth, and by a massive margin, Canada's single biggest trading partner. The overwhelming share of everything Canada sells, it sells to the country just across that line. And when your most important customer is right there to the south, living near the border stops being a quirk and becomes a serious advantage, it's why so much of Canadian industry clusters in the south. The auto factories of southern Ontario, for instance, sit just a short drive from American plants, parts, and buyers, plugged directly into a cross border supply chain. Being close to the line means cheaper shipping, faster trade, and easy access to that enormous market. The sheer gravity of the US economy quietly pulls Canadian jobs and Canadian people toward it. So, what about the North? Doesn't it produce anything at all? It does. But the way it produces explains the emptiness perfectly. The northern economy runs on resource extraction mining, oil, gas, and forestry. And those industries are capital intensive, not people intensive. They need expensive machines and a small, specialized crew, often flown in and out on shifts, not sprawling cities full of families. A diamond mine, worth billions, might employ only a few hundred people in the middle of nowhere. The North generates a fortune. It just doesn't generate population. Which brings us to what Canada actually looks like today. Add it all together, geography, history, and economics, and you get one of the most lopsided countries on the planet. More than half of all Canadians live in a single corridor running from Quebec City through Montreal and Ottawa down to Toronto and Windsor. Add the city of Vancouver in the far southwest and the Calgary Edmonton region in Alberta, and you've now accounted for the large majority of the entire nation. Then, look back at the top of the map. Canada's three northern territories, Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, together cover roughly 40% of the country's land. That's an area larger than India. And the total number of people living across all of it? Well, under 1% of Canada's population. To put that in perspective, far more people live in the Greater Toronto area alone than in that entire northern 40% of the country. And daily life up there shows you exactly how hard the geography pushes back. Many northern communities have no road connecting them to the rest of Canada at all. They're reached only by plane, by seasonal ice roads carved across the frozen ground each winter, or by a single rail line. Because nearly everything has to be flown or shipped in from the south, the cost of basics like food and fuel can be staggering. The far north isn't empty because Canadians never bothered to try. It's empty because the land makes living there extraordinarily hard and extraordinarily expensive. So, we arrive back where we started, and back at that clue from the very beginning. On a map, Canada looks like a country with endless room, an entire empty continent just waiting to be filled. But that emptiness isn't a failure, and it isn't an accident. The geography only ever allowed real large scale settlement in one place. That thin southern ribbon, where the climate is gentle enough, the soil is good enough, the water is right there, the trade is close, and the history was built to match. The border that 90% of Canadians cling to was never a political line shoving them south. It very nearly traces the natural southern edge of livable Canada itself. The crowded ribbon isn't the strange part of the country, it's the only part the land was ever going to allow. And that empty giant stretching above it was never the exception. It was always the rule. I hope you enjoyed learning about why Canada huddles against its border. If you did, Be sure to check out our video on the Canadian town you can't even drive to. Thanks for watching. See you next time.